Welcome to Modern Steel Construction's Field Notes podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Weisenberger. So, this month you're probably familiar with our guest, Larry Muir, whose name appears in just about every issue of Modern Steel Construction as one of the steel wizards answering questions for AISC Steel Solutions Center and in our Steel Interchange column. Larry is currently a consultant to the steel construction industry via his company, The Steel Connection. He was also chief engineer for Surveys Steel and actually direct employee for AISC as our director of technical assistance for the Steel Solutions Center. He also won an AISC T.R. Higgins Award a few years ago. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you, Jeff.
I'm glad you're here. So I always feel like I start these off with, let's start at the beginning. Where are you from? Where did you grow up?
So I actually am from and grew up just outside of Chicago in the suburbs. So it was a unincorporated huge subdivision called Boulder Hill out in Oswego, Illinois.
Oh, okay, sure. I know vaguely. Well, I know where Oswego is. Okay.
Yeah.
So you like, was that basically your entire youth?
Yeah, so we lived in Illinois. My family lived there all the way from the time I was born until I had started college, and then in 1990 we moved to the Atlanta area.
Okay.
Yeah, I grew up in Illinois, just outside Chicago.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah. Okay. Now I know you're near Atlanta now, and I was going to get to that as well. So speaking of college, where did you end up going to school?
So I started out at a school up in Illinois, which was called Illinois Benedictine College at the time. I think it's called Benedictine University,
Sure.
and started as a chemistry major because I had worked at the Amoco Research Center up there in Naperville. My dad had worked there. So
Okay.
chemistry seemed to be a place to sort of, that I thought I might be interested in. And that didn't work out for me. And I ended up, came pretty close to dropping out of school, actually. And then my parents moved down to Georgia. I came with them, went to a place called, I went to a lot of colleges where the names changed. So when I was there, it was the Southern College of Technology. They called it Southern Tech, and now it's actually part of Kennesaw State University, but I think they still call it Southern Polytechnic University. And I got my bachelor's degree there in engineering technology, and then I got a master's degree at the University of Tennessee up in Knoxville. And then I went to work for Surveys and had some issues getting licensed because my first degree was an engineering technology degree, and some of the way the state laws are written wouldn't allow me to get licensed. So then I went back to University of Tennessee in Knoxville and got a second bachelor's degree after having obtained a master's degree.
That's very interesting. I've never heard that progression.
Yeah.
Bachelor's, master's, bachelor's. So at what point, I guess, did you start to kind of make that shift into getting into buildings or to construction?
Yes. So it was, I started out in chemistry, as I said, and
Right.
then I moved. My dad had this idea that if you're going to go to college, you went to college and got a degree in the sciences, because if you got a degree in the sciences, then you were more likely to get a job.
Sure.
And so that kind of set some parameters on what I was going to be looking at. And so I went from chemistry to chemical engineering,
Okay.
which then sort of got me into the engineering thing. I was at Illinois Benedictine, which did not have an engineering program. They had a pre-engineering program. So I got some basic engineering courses taught by physics professors mostly.
Okay.
But that sort of got me into engineering. And then I decided I really didn't want to be in chemical engineering. And I switched over to mechanical very briefly, and really had not done well. And so I was like sort of heading towards the path of dropping out of college, frankly.
Right.
And my dad sort of begged me to stay in, and I decided to give it one last shot. His advice to me was that I didn't want to leave not knowing whether I could do it. I wanted to know that I could do it, and had chosen not to. And so I kind of set about set this plan in place where I was going to try to get straight A's and then drop out of college. But I had burned all my bridges in the mechanical engineering department at that point, and so I literally took the course book at Southern Tech, which was an engineering school, so it was very likely I was going to end up in engineering. But I flipped the pages and stuck my finger in, and it was engineering, civil engineering technology. And so I went over to the civil engineering department and applied over there and was accepted. And that's how I ended up in civil engineering. And then I took some, you take some basic structures courses uh, as part of a civil engineering program.
Uh-huh.
And I sort of clicked with those. And I, like I said, was kind of determined to get A's, and I did that. And then I decided, once I was doing well, I actually sort of enjoyed it. And so then I, continued, and part of it was structures made sense to me. I enjoyed structural engineering. And then part of it was also that it seemed like structural engineering seemed to be the more difficult specialization for a lot of people, and people tended to avoid those classes. And I figured if I went into structural engineering, then there'd be less competition when I got out, and maybe I'd do a little bit better. So that was kind of how I got there, designing airplanes.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and I ended up not doing that, but that sort of opened my eyes to this whole possibility. That there are all kinds of structures and all kinds of things you can do in structural engineering,
Mhm.
beyond just buildings and bridges. But my first job I got was actually designing bridges or buildings, and they were mostly smaller scale buildings. It was a small engineering firm, and I had decided to go there because I thought if I was in a smaller group, I'd have more opportunity to learn, more opportunity to be involved in a wider range of aspects of the projects. And so I did that, and then in that process, I realized that there were these things called shop drawings that came from the fabricator, and
Mhm.
I was the least experienced person in the office, but often was assigned to review the shop drawings, or at least do a lot of transferring of marks and that kind of stuff on these shop drawings. And I started asking questions about all the connections I was seeing and who designs those and how are they designed and who's responsible. And,
Right.
and the answers I got in a lot of cases weren't very satisfying. And I thought to myself that, this was really, these connections are what hold the entire structure together, and they must be important. And somebody out there must know how they work. And so when I went to get a master's degree, I kind of went in with the idea that I was going to get a master's degree, and then I was going to come out and work for a fabricator. So I sort of started on that path fairly early. Um, but it turned out, though there was a course listed in the catalog at the University of Tennessee on connection design, it wasn't actually offered,
Mhm.
and it ultimately was not offered. And then when I got out of the University of Tennessee with that master's degree, and I started looking for fabricators to work for, I found that a lot of fabricators didn't have people on staff who did connection design. But I had read some papers by Bill Thornton, who at that time was chief engineer at Surveys Steel.
Mhm.
And so, kind of another odd thing I did in my career was, rather than applying to work for Surveys Steel through the normal process of writing a letter to the company, with my resume and all that, I actually wrote a letter to Bill and applied to him directly. And fortunately, even though they weren't really in the market for a new employee, I guess that prompted them to go ahead and hire me. And that's kind of how I got into the fabrication side of things.
I think that's a really, yeah, interesting backdoor, so to speak, or a side door. I'm not sure what, but that's a really great way of landing a job. Um, so tell me a little bit then about your work there at Surveys. So yeah, can you maybe just like I guess how you started, and then where you went from there? Because I know you became the chief engineer yourself eventually. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so I didn't start there. I didn't start out going into that job
Of
thinking I
course.
was going to be the chief engineer at some point, and frankly, had pretty low, I guess, expectations in a lot of respects. But when I went to work for Bill, and I wrote that letter to Bill, in part because I, had come out of school, I had a degree, and I needed a job. But also I had read his papers, and I kind of liked the way he thought and the way he seemed to approach problems from what I had read. And then when I went to work for Surveys, my perceptions turned out to be pretty accurate. I got along with Bill pretty well. We thought about problems in kind of similar ways. I learned a lot. I had, because of the way I think I had applied for that position, I had sort of additional pressures on me to perform. So I spent a lot of time on weekends and nights, studying, when something would come up
Mhm.
and I didn't really understand what was going on. I wasn't afraid to ask questions of Bill, but I wanted to try best I could to figure them out, or at least be well prepared when I went to him with questions. And then, so that kind of, then evolved into uh, actually participating in some of the committees at AISC and some of the other organizations in our industry. First as a guest, because Bill would be working on something, I would start working on it. And then I would have something, of value to add in some of those meetings. And then eventually, I became a member of a number of these committees. And then as Bill, got to the age where he was looking to scale back some, and Surveys was going to be looking, for a replacement as chief engineer,
Mhm.
I sort of fit into that mold. I was kind of, on my way there, and that was part of what prompted me to go back and get the second bachelor's degree, because as chief engineer, I was going to need to be licensed in
Right.
many states, and I think I was licensed in 34 states by the time I was done. And so I, needed to overcome that obstacle. So there were a lot of there wasn't a grand plan to get there, but it sort of evolved in that direction.
Let's switch gears a little bit and just talk about the Steel Solutions Center and your role there. So, I mean, you were you worked for the SSC directly. You've also been a consultant for a long time. I mean, one question that springs to mind is: do you think helping other engineers with their issues, so to speak, has made you a better engineer?
Yeah, so the answer to the first question is yes, it's definitely made me a better engineer. I think anytime you have to explain something to another person, essentially teach somebody something, you're going to learn the topic better. And that's kind of the way I approach the work at the Steel Solution Center. What I try to do is help them, if there's something that specifically addresses it in the specification, obviously I want to point them to that. But then beyond that, I want them to hopefully understand, why we're doing that in the specification, or if they've got a situation that's not exactly what was intended to be addressed in the specification, understand why their situation's a little bit different and how they can adapt what's in the specification to what they're doing. And in order to do that, I oftentimes have to dig pretty deep into, where did this come from? What was the research, or what was the analysis? How did it change over time in the specification, so that I can understand it, and ultimately convey that information to somebody else. And so, yeah, I've had to do, we answer, especially when I took over as the director of technical services. I had to, up to that point, because I had been a consultant with the Solution Center prior to that.
Mhm.
And my job at that, as a consultant, was to answer questions about connection design. So it was sort of to answer things within the scope of what I was comfortable with and
Sure.
what I had done for, more than a decade prior to that. But when I became sort of the boss, I was responsible for answering everything. And if I wasn't answering it, I was reviewing it. Then I had to get more into, the provisions to design beams and columns and stability on frames and things that I really hadn't had to deal with very much in my life as a connection designer for a fabricator. So it pushed me, and yeah, it's definitely made me a better and a given me a broader scope of what I know about the design of steel and the specification.
I want to talk a little bit about the steel connection itself. So, what can you tell me a little bit about that endeavor and what it was like going out on your own, so to speak, as a consultant?
Yeah, it was a lot of things in my life just sort of seemed to evolve, I guess is the way it works. I try to you try to plan things, but you never know how things are going to work. I think it was Mike Tyson said everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face. And so I left Surveys, and I had, Surveys was a very demanding job, and I had a new family and wanted to spend more time with my family. And I that was kind of what led to that decision. Um, and I really didn't know what I was going to do.
Hmm.
But I sort of knew I was going to, be involved in structural engineering and probably connection design in some form. So I wanted to form, a company, partly, with, liability and bookkeeping and that kind of stuff. So I formed this steel connection. When I left Surveys, as it turned out, I just happened to be at um, a committee meeting. I think it was an RCSC committee meeting, actually, on the day my official last day with Surveys. And I think I was standing in the lunch line with Charlie Carter, and I told him that I was leaving Surveys, and my hope was that I was still going to be welcome at all these committees. And Charlie, assured me that I would, but beyond that, mentioned this thing called the Steel Solution Center,
Hmm.
and they needed a consultant, and he was interested, wanted to know whether I was interested in doing that, and I was, and so that was a nice sort of thing that happened, because that kind of gave me a baseline income, and then I wasn't sure what the rest of my work was going to look like. Originally, when I put the Steel Connection, when I formed the company, my thought was that I was going to do connection design, that I was going to do kind of production type connection design on projects, which would have likely involved having to hire some staff, because I just simply couldn't, handle that kind of volume on my own. But then, once I started seeing, what was necessary in the industry, I realized that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I wasn't interested in running a company. I wasn't interested in sort of all the administrative parts of that so much as I was on the technical side. And so that's sort of the way it developed. And part of the reason I think that happened too was because I left around 2008, and that was when the economy sort of shrank considerably, the financial collapse. And what happened during that period was a lot of engineers and fabricators and so on, were kind of desperate for work, and so they started taking on work that wasn't familiar to them. And that resulted in a lot of problems that had to be resolved, and so that's sort of where I found my niche.
It sounds like you've been in the Atlanta area, or when you're not off in Knoxville, pursuing various degrees. But since the early '90s, are you in? You're still there? Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we still live in Atlanta.
Okay. Well, I'm just curious. What are some of the things you like most about it?
It's an incredibly diverse area. Especially where we live right now, which is kind of just outside 285, which they call the perimeter on the northeast side. And there's we're not in Gwinnett County, but Gwinnett County is, I think, one of the most diverse counties in the entire country. Um, and so it's interesting to see, that kind of, to be able to be at home and experience a wide range of different cultures, and see some of the issues that arise from that. So it's a good city.
Sure, sure. It seems I my experience there is limited, but it seems like It's very lush, very green, and it seems like, I mean, you're not terribly far away from a lot of like natural, like beautiful geography. Like there are now they're not giant mountains nearby, but there are mountains nearby, and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, and I used to when I for some reason, my we as a family we never, when I formed my own family, we did some hiking up in the mountains and stuff, but not as much as I did when I was single and on my own. I would go up there into the North Georgia mountains almost every weekend and do some sort of hiking up there. So yeah, there's a lot of waterfalls, a lot of beautiful scenery. It is a very green, area. There's a lot of trees in Atlanta. That's sort of what it's known for. Yeah.
Well, here I'm going to switch gears yet again and talk about a hobby. I understand that you've got. You play the guitar, or you played the guitar. Which is it? Do you still currently play?
I do play guitar, and I enjoy it. I won't say that I play well. The way I like to put it is, if there was a storm coming and you had the choice between listening to Eric Clapton play guitar in a building he designed or listening to me play guitar in a building I designed, I think you would rather listen to me than him. Not because I play so well, but I
Sure,
probably design a building a little bit better.
I
Um,
would think so.
yeah.
Well,
But yeah, I enjoy it. I can't claim to be good, but I've played ever. I guess I started when I was in high school.
okay, yeah, that's what I was going to ask. When did you pick it up? So high school, okay, and it's just kind of stuck with you through the years.
Yeah, I'm a huge music fan. And I, spent a lot of my youth going to used record stores and bought hundreds or thousands, whatever, of LPs, and have continued that with CDs, and just have a very wide range of music that I enjoy. And so it sort of seemed, I don't know, natural to me, or that was sort of my incentive to at least wanting to develop some sort of skill musically. And so we got some guitars. We worked at a place up there in Illinois, a department store that went out of business, and they had guitars, very cheap, not very good guitars, but they started discounting things, and when those guitars got to 80% off or whatever, me and some of my buddies bought guitars and began to learn, and learned at very different rates. So there was one guy who got very good very quickly, and I was a bit slower, but I'm passable, I guess.
Well, that's good. No, I like that. Like if the price gets down to such and such, that's when we go in on the guitar. It's almost like buying stock.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, hey, I've got just one more question. And this is a fun one, and this is something that Carlo told me. But I heard he gave me a story, or told me a story about how, I guess, you were on a job site for a project, or you had to be near the project for an extended period of time, and you were at a motel, and somebody showed up, or a sheriff showed up, because there had been a recent robbery, and somehow you were a suspect. Is that something you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. So this was
Did
this
you did
was
you do it?
I did not rob the bank.
Oh, there we go. Okay, okay.
So, but it was interesting, I guess, maybe on several fronts. So I had not. This was when I was at Surveys, and Surveys had a training program where you went through each aspect of a project. So you spent some time in the detailing office, you spent some time in the shop, and you spent some time in the field. So I was down in the field. It was in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi.
Okay.
And the job site was actually in Pearlington, Mississippi, but I was staying in Bay St. Louis. And our field rep down there would, every afternoon, drop me off across the street from where I was staying.
Okay.
And it was a fairly busy, 4-lane divided road, and I would Frogger it kind of across the highway to my extended stay hotel or motel. And so one evening, one afternoon, we're coming back, and there was a roadblock, and they were stopping cars and asking questions, and the guy I was with gave various explanations as to why this might be happening, but we had no idea about any indication that had been a bank robbery or anything. But we weren't actually stopped. So we went through the roadblock, and then he dropped me off down the road, and I ran across to the hotel, and I was in there, and there was a knock at the door, and I opened the door, and there's a gentleman standing there, with like this brown suit, with a vest and a pocket watch and a mustache, and the whole bit. And he flashes a badge, and he says, I'm with the Bay St. Louis Police Department, and you were seen running from the scene of a crime today, and we've got some questions for you. Or I've got some questions for you. And so I was a little hesitant, and I said, look, you come to my door, and you flash a badge, and you say you're a police officer, but I really don't know who you are. And I said, if you want to come back with some uniformed police officers, I'll be happy to talk to you. And so he like raised his hand and motioned to either side of him, and two uniformed police officers with their guns drawn suddenly appeared, that apparently were waiting for me to make a run for it or something, I guess.
Oh.
And so he came in and started asking me questions, asked if they could look around. I said they could. And so the two uniformed police officers began sort of disassembling my residence there. And he's asking me questions, and it became clear that, there had been some sort of bank robbery. And it turned out that there had actually been a whole string of bank robberies in that area. And so at the end, I asked him, he asked me actually if I had any plans to leave the state. And I said, well, I've got a trip in a couple weeks home, and I'm going to be flying out of the New Orleans airport. And he handed me a card and said, well, call me before you leave, because there'll be a bulletin out on you, and you won't be able to board the plane. And so the worst part of this was that, as I said, I was down there as part of a training program, which, indicates that I hadn't been with Surveys very long. But I felt like I needed to call the corporate office and tell them that I was under investigation for bank robbery, which is probably, it's not the most comfortable thing to do as a new employee. But it all got resolved, and I did not end up in jail, and there's no jars of money buried in my backyard.